Charlie says, always tell your mummy before you watch one of Grimm's videos, because he swears a lot.
Hello lovelies, or filthy reprobates, whichever you prefer. Today we are going to be taking a look at Dungeon Crawl Classics, and I know that my take on this is going to be interesting to some people because they're big fans of Dungeon Crawl Classics. Now, getting DCC kind of goes against one of my cardinal rules, though I don't keep the rule very well. Anyway, because DCC requires novelty dice. So you don't just have your D20s, you have your D24. You have a D3. You have all kinds of odd dice outside the norm that aren't actually regular polyhedrons in some cases. So, like this D3, for example. These are called Zocchi dice or Zocchi dice. You can get them easily enough these days through Amazon and so on, and they are just numbers. And there are ways to simulate them using other dice, so you're not completely shit out of luck if you can't find them. They're relatively easy to get these days, and they're numbers. They're not novelty dice in quite the way that I complain about. Fantasy Flight games are guilty of the kind of novelty dice that I talk about, and their dice sets are quite nice anyway. Nice things to own, nice curiosities if you're a horrible dice goblin, and they come with some nice art and so on the bottles. Touch pricey, but you know, I've seen people buying dice made out of human bone and God knows what else, so not necessarily that pricey compared to some. Also, there are free apps for phones which have all of these peculiar dice on them. This one is rather unhandily called Dice, and it has all of the special dice that they talk about. You can even make them glow and so on, and it even has a D1000 should the urge to play Fatal overcome you somehow. So there's that. Right, it's an old school game, but not. DCC kind of defies easy categorization and explanation. It's not exactly gonzo, but it's certainly gonzoid. The way in which things tend to bend during play and as a result of the rules and so on will tend towards gonzo. One of the big appeals of old school games is simplicity, but considering you could beat a horse to death with Dungeon Crawl Classics, and it's 500 pages, so about as big as Whitechester. Some of that simplicity goes away. Fortunately, a lot of the rules and so on that end up bloating it are optional, ignorable. You can work your way around them one way or another. So yeah, you've got options. Okay, let's crack it open. I got the soft cover, I think, printed by Drive-Thru RPGs printers. A lot of the art's black and white, which is good. A lot of the art is very old school, which is good. It might not necessarily be technically as proficient as a lot of art in modern games, but it captures that naive, almost outsider art feel of early D&D, and the way in which that art wasn't necessarily the best, but it was inspiring. And there are more technical pieces, and there is a lot of art, so that's one of the big positives I would say for DCC. Personally, I've been tending away from more art, forsaking art for content, though the ability to produce AI art for filler has certainly changed that somewhat. It's much easier to produce certain kinds of art, which leaves you more budget for the better pieces that you want to get. So it's all swings and roundabouts, a lot of these things are. I'm pretty sure this was the drive-through printing, and I wish they would use a better printer, because I think they use lightning source and their colour work is just terrible when it comes to interiors. You've heard me complain about colour art in lots of books. In this instance, I don't think it's the fault of the creators, I think it's the fault of the printer. Lulu's print quality is just better, at least from whichever print house they use to deliver to me, but there you go. Yeah, so this is a big hefty book, lots of art. I love this. How is this game different from what you've played before? And basically runs down the important differences between DCC and your D&D derivatives. And it's all broadly speaking compatible, but DCC deals with a lot of the issues that I've always had with old school D&D. Not all of them, but a lot of them, like making fighters feel useful and individuated and unique. It does use the novelty dice. You might complain about that. They're not novelty dice, as I said, in the sense to which I normally object to them. And it does form a nice dice chain. You know, D3, D4, D5, D6, D7, D8, D10, D12, D14, D16, D20, D24, D30. So you have a nice smooth thing, the same as you can do in other games with more compressed lines, which might go, like my own actual fucking monsters, which goes D4, D6, D8, D10, D12, but that limits you to kind of 1 to 5. Right? Whereas this opens it out much larger, so you can have that same effect, but on a larger scale. So that's quite nice, and it does make scaling and so on easy if you bring something back into DCC, but it can cause some conversion issues the other way. The ability scores, some are familiar, some aren't, but you'll basically recognize them from any D&D derivative. Strength, agility, dexterity, stamina, constitution, personality, charisma, intelligence. There's no wisdom equivalent, but you do have luck. And one of the other interesting things that differentiates DCC is the ability to burn certain things, that is, permanently remove from certain statistics, like luck, in order to get advantages on rolls and so on. And you can do that after the fact. So that helps increase the survivability of some characters and works similarly to the way I did morale in Whitechester, except in this case it's kind of permanent. So that's something to think about, perhaps. There's lots of details. You get 3 saving throws, which will be familiar to people from 3rd edition. It is a class and level based game, and what's interesting to me is you start off at 0 level. So you start out as a peasant or equivalent, who is taking up the adventuring life for the first time and is probably going to die. So you get to roll for your starting occupation. That tells you what you did, a type of weapon you might be trained in using, which might not even be a weapon at all, but it's something you can use, and some starting trade goods. And from there, you're on your way to be whatever. A lot of the art in here is humorous. You'll recognise the artists from things like Paranoia and so on, and there are even out-and-out cartoons here and there, which is nice to see. Assuming you survive your first couple of adventures, you might level up, and at that point you can go into a class. The classes will again be broadly familiar: cleric, thief, warrior, wizard. It uses race as class, which I've never liked, but I can forgive it, and it wouldn't be too difficult to retro convert to stat bonuses and things. So you've got dwarf, elf, and halfling. So that's all fairly familiar to everyone. The kind of abilities that they all get, that's also fairly familiar. There is a skill system. It's not really that complicated. if you're skilled in something, you get a higher dice to roll. If you're not skilled in something, you get a lower dice to roll. And that's pretty much it. You may or may not be trained in something. You roll that dice, you add your stat bonuses, you defeat a target number. All very familiar. What's different is the use of different dice, and so on. Equipment is again going to be fairly familiar. You know, weapons, damage, armor. AC is ascending. There's enough options there, and you can certainly come up with more without too much trouble. The money aspect doesn't seem to be as out of hand, certainly as modern D&D has gotten, so that's nice to see. Going back to classes for a second, so depending what class you are, you might be more likely to get a critical in combat, and your criticals might be more likely to do more damage or to have other effects like stunning someone, knocking them out, that sort of thing. So that helps make the fighting class, the warrior, much more effective. You also have the option to do like heroic combat deeds, which can be anything. It's wide open, and for that to succeed, you need to roll 3 or higher on your combat dice. So warriors, for example, they don't have a straight bonus in combat like +3 to attack. They have a dice bonus to attack. So instead of rolling d20 plus 6, whatever, oh dear, a botch. Yeah, so 4, that's not very good, and that's a botch on the d20. But that means your attack bonus is variable. So if you choose to do a combat deed, you need to get 3 or higher on that. So Dave the Barbarian attempts to stab through a gap in the Black Knight's armor, in his visor or something. So you roll, he got 6, that's over 3, so you might roll that he can ignore the armor. He got a 17 on his d20, you add the 2 together, 23 to hit. Does that beat his armor class? If it does, hit, and then you can apply the effect as you want. Unfortunately, I think that does shut out the other classes from being able to do heroic deeds, targeted attacks and so on, which is something they should be able to do in combat as well, albeit not as good as the warrior. You know, you want a certain amount of niche protection. I think that's fixable. You just take the bonus as being the die type, and if you can't beat 3 at all, then you don't, and then you just ignore what you roll and just take the flat bonus that you get. So that would be one way to deal with it. Or you could require a critical hit, but you still allow them to do the deed or whatever. This is where the rules bloat starts to come in, because depending what class you are and what level you are, you might use a different critical hit table, and you're going to be rolling different dice for the crits. And depending what armor you're wearing, you're going to be rolling a different die if you fumble, and so on. It gives descriptions of some typical combat maneuvers you might do, which is useful, but really it's meant to be wide open. I did something similar in Machinations of the Space Princess, where you can do a special attack of any kind you want, but you just take a -5 penalty to your attack. And because the fighting class, the killer in that instance, is the only one that really gets a higher attack skill, that makes those options far more possible for them. This works in a similar way, it goes up rather than offsetting penalties and so on. So you can permanently burn your luck score to give yourself bonuses to a roll. So you can reduce your luck by 6 to give yourself a +6 modifier on the roll. So if you're about to die or something, it might well be worth disintegrating your luck and crippling yourself in the future to survive in the moment. It's quite deadly. Criticals are more likely, especially for warriors, and much more effective sometimes than they are in standard retroclones and so on. Magic has a tendency to go off the rails somewhat, but casting your spell doesn't mean that you can't cast it again. You don't have spell slots per se, but you have a chance of not being able to cast that spell again if you fuck up royally. You'll also tend to get corrupted and mutated by magic. So yeah, it's far more gonzo, far more dark, but it is dark as a consequence of the rules. And again, the magic is where it does get bogged down a bit in all kinds of optional rules and affects the corruption that takes place as magic warps your body. Casting as rituals, not casting as rituals, creating magic items, learning spells and so on. And a big issue, I think, for a lot of people will be the fact that each spell takes up a whole page. So just taking the very first spell in the spell section, animal summoning. So you got your basic information. It's a level 1 spell, range 20 feet. The duration varies. Casting time lasts a round, no save against it. Quick description, how it manifests, chances of corruption, chances of misfire, what misfire does, and then the varying effect that the spell can have, actually stretching over 2 pages for one spell. I mean, it's flavorful. It's lovely in that sense, but imagine having to reference this stuff while you're playing. You know, it's going to be a little bit tricky, and so the spells take up a lot of space, despite there not actually being that huge a number of them. I think that's a drawback of the system, but again, it's something you could choose to ignore if you wanted to. There's some of the cartoon art I was talking about. He had a pretty bad level drain last night. Wizards turned into a kid. So yeah, you'll find those kind of controversial, nasty elements from older versions of D&D in here, like level drain, permanent stat loss, that sort of thing. But a lot of us like the challenge, you know? It's the Dark Souls of TTRPGs, more so than the actual Dark Souls TTRPG. But there you go. More spells. You can see the issue that I'm talking about. So I'm just gonna skip through. La 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 la. There's cleric spells as well. They're not quite as random, but nor are they quite as powerful. Okay. So, having just finished the magic section and impressed upon you how random and capricious and dangerous to your character it is, I should go back a bit and talk about the funnel. The funnel is probably the most famous part of Dungeon Crawl Classics. That is, when you go to start play, you make up several level 0 characters, and then you see who survives that first adventure, and then you pick one of them, presuming they've leveled, to be your main character, the one that you're going to take forward, the one that's going to develop into a class and so on. This is controversial. There's a much stronger narrative thread in RPGs these days that views backstory and stuff that happens before play as being more important. So this is kind of a backlash to that, but I think it's a very good way of setting expectations that death can happen randomly at any point with no warning whatsoever, and it's a good idea to have backup characters and not to get too attached necessarily, and to let the story of the character emerge through play or through character creation. You know, there's a few tables and things in character creation. So I can see why people object to the funnel, because they want to start the game with a character with a rich and deep backstory, but often that doesn't make sense, particularly in class level games. And DCC definitely, through the funnel, which you don't have to use, but through it certainly informs you what kind of game you're getting into and sets expectations, and it does it using the rules as written, which I think is a good way to do it. You know, one of the things you do as a game designer is you encourage certain types of play that you want to see by the way in which you set up the rules. And so by having multiple characters character death right from the get-go. DCC is very effectively managing expectations, I think, and also gatekeeping, because certain people are never going to want to play a game like that, so, you know, they can go. So the magic system was a bit bloated, but you do have other sections which is useful information, how fast, you know, you can travel at medieval speed, how unlikely it was that you would travel very far beyond your surroundings, rules for retainers, followers, all of that kind of thing. And then we get into the judges section, so judge rather than dungeon master or games master, which also helps manage expectations, I think, the same way that storyteller as a title for a games master changed expectations in White Wolf. I think the judge, or going back to judge, has been used in various games. Sets you up as the GM to be more of a referee and a rules moderator than anything else, perhaps. So yeah, it's no bad thing. The Games Master advice is fine, useful. I mean, you might be intimidated by the scale of the book and the sheer degree of randomness. I would suggest printing stuff out if you've got a PDF copy, so that you have multiple copies for people to reference. There are useful tables in the back. Yeah, the DM advice is good. The setting and so on is fairly implied rather than explicit, but there's nothing necessarily wrong with that either. I mean, for me, what really sells this, what made me excited about it, what made me read through it more than once and try to grapple with the system, was the sheer amount of art and the fact that it was styled very much after the old versions of D&D. I find the bland, corporate, muddy looking, desperately inclusive, rather than effective art that a lot of modern RPGs go for. I find that disappointing and I find it ineffective, whereas almost every page here in DCC has something that can inspire you, whether as a player, oh, I want my character to end up in a situation like that, or as a games master, oh, I want to include this, that, or the other in my adventure. So a lot of the inspiration, when it's not coming from the sheer randomness of many of the things that happen thanks to the rules, I think comes from the art, and it really does capture that sense of inspiration and wonder that you got from the older versions of D&D, even though they didn't necessarily have the same quality as modern art in RPGs. There was a lot going for them in terms of inspiration, and your own scratchy doodles of your characters and so on didn't necessarily seem as bad. When clearly that was what some people had done for the artwork in some of those early adventures and so on. I mean, here it is better, but it retains that spirit and that charm. Bestiary is quite fulsome and has options for customizing different types of creatures. Again, there are aspects of it that might be a little bit overcomplicated or more complicated than necessary, but overall it's fine, does the job perfectly well. Excuse me, plenty to inspire you. Again, more appendices and useful stuff to dip into. Lists of third-party publishers who produce stuff for DCC. They've got a license which I'm looking into because I might do a conversion book for Whitechester. And then it ends with, you know, decent references, types of title, the tables for stuff you need to play, and so on. An example dungeon. Yeah, kind of basic, but that's what you want. It doesn't waste too much space, I guess. You know how I feel about wasting space in main books with adventures. The index is okay, but not great. The adverts and so on at the end are funny. sometimes hilarious. People of a certain age who read certain comics and magazines will recognise what they're ripping off there. Yeah, and there's the reference tables, which I would suggest photocopying or printing out several copies of. Having like cliff notes and so on, and it's probably worth it for any Magic users to print out their spell sheets. Maybe glue them into a book for inspiration at the table. Have like a prop. Adverts, that's something you don't see in the back of games very often anymore, so that was interesting. That actually weirdly used to be a way in which we found out about a lot of other games way back when. So yeah, what do I think overall? In terms of style, I don't think it can be faulted necessarily. Certainly the artwork and so on is great, inspiring, nostalgic for me at least. I don't know how more modern players would react to it. Probably not well. I don't like anything. But for me, that was great. I do feel that certain aspects of the game are a bit bloated, and that takes away from the core parts that make DCC good. I look forward to playing it at some point. In terms of style then, I'd give it a 4, because the only things letting it down are some of the rules bloat and the fact that it is so unwieldy to use and reference at the table, necessitating the printing out of cheat sheets to go with character sheets and so on. But it is very complete. But obviously, you know, if Beck Me books were like 32 pages saddle stitched, and this is 500 pages, you know, you're not really looking at the same sort of beast, and certain sacrifices have been made. In terms of substance, I mean, it's complete. Everything is there that you'd need or want, or sufficient is there for you to create your own stuff on top of what's there. So with relative ease. So in terms of substance, 5. So that's 9 out of 10, 4.5 out of 5. High praise indeed from me, considering I didn't start with D&D. I don't have the member berries for D&D. DCC is far more exciting and interesting, and deals with some of the issues that I've always had with old school clones. So yeah, recommended, highly so. Zang. I have a fairly mellow Discord if you want to join us there for a bit of conversation and debate. We have people from all over, really, and for the most part, it's fairly good-natured and peaceful. As long as you come in that kind of spirit, you'll be fine. Postmortem Studios sells a wide variety of stock art, well over 500 pieces, many of them by RPG industry veteran Brad McDevitt. These are available for you to use in your personal or professional projects, whether stories or games or anything else. Check us out at rpgnow.com.